Yasodhara Jamuna Tera Banachari.
Namaste. Welcome to the podcast, Meaningful Lives. I'm Swami Lalitananda, the director of Yasodhara Ashram. In this series, I'm talking to people from diverse backgrounds who are driven to fulfill an inner calling and to give back to life through their particular gifts. I first met Candace Batycki earlier this year when she attended the 3-month yoga development course at the ashram. I was showing her and a few others around on a tour, and I was immediately struck by Candace's joyful presence, her humor and curiosity, her love of the land, especially Kootenay Lake, she mentioned, and her respect for the sacred, which somehow was obvious to me. Now, 3 months after the YDC, Candace has come by to offer a few days of karma yoga. I'm so happy to find out what's happening and to find out more about what gives life meaning. So namaste, Candace, and welcome.
Namaste.
I thought you could introduce yourself and say a little bit about your life to this point. Where's your focus been in your work?
Right. So since 1989, I have worked in conservation. I have worked for all beings in the sense of species, endangered species and their recovery, for the protection of wildlands and waters, and a little bit of work on what we would maybe call forestry reform. So I would say I started off as an environmentalist, and over time I became more of a conservationist and eventually, a manager and director in a nonprofit. So it's been almost more than 30 years that I've been in various guises. But if I had to sort of summarize it in my own mind, I would say it's really about justice for all beings.
I'm just curious about the 2 words you used, or 3 words really, but ecologist to conservationist.
Yeah.
So what is the difference between those 2?
In the early days, I was younger, and I was, they used to talk about the angry young man. I was kind of an angry young woman, really. And I saw things that were happening in the world and the loss of nature. And it saddened me, and it made me angry, and I really wanted things to change. And I found, in my late 20s, I found a lot of excitement being out in the streets, changing things, and finding other people who felt passionate and were emotionally driven to protect the things that they loved, particularly the wild world and all the beings in it. And then as I learned about change and how to make change, I went through an evolution. We all go through evolutions over decades in our lives, and I became a student of change, I think, and I wanted to be effective. I didn't, and I think I'm still asking that question every day: what's effective when it comes to change? That's a lifelong question that I think I will always hold, because that's always, the answers are always changing. So as I moved into where it became my job, I became employed in the nonprofit environmental movement, which at that point was still, I was in the United States, actually, even though I'm born and raised in British Columbia. I started off there in the United States because nobody got paid to be an environmentalist in Canada at that time. That came later as that sector of civil society grew. We've always had nonprofits in healthcare and social services and that kind of thing, but we didn't have that in the 80s and 90s, or till the mid-90s, actually, in British Columbia. So I came of age at a time where that could be my career. So that was, to me, wonderful, that I could spend my days, trying to save the earth and protect what I love so much. Yeah. And then as I became more and more experienced, I added more skills to my repertoire, and I became good at government relations, and I had always had communications as part of what I was good at. I studied journalism early on in my life before I became an environmentalist even. And so all of those things contributed to me being able to take on more and more senior roles inside organizations, and then to help other people to have small teams and staff, and, and up to becoming a director. And just recently I retired as director of landscape protection for a nonprofit called Yellowstone to Yukon. So that's kind of the trajectory of life. But that doesn't mean that I don't see value in all those tactics and strategies. I started off kind of out in the streets, and now that I'm retired, I think I'm going back to the streets, honestly.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's evolution. With all the knowledge that you have, you would be coming from a very different place.
Yeah.
It sounds to me, and because we're talking about meaning in life, that you were really drawn to that area. Almost, you couldn't not do it.
Yeah.
And I wonder also with your idea of justice for all living beings, how that relates, because I know that you have a Buddhist background as well. And how does that come into you as a person, or the values, or why were you attracted to Buddhism?
So I started meditating in the Buddhist tradition in the early 1990s. So I had been, again, that sort of angry young woman phase, right? And I had kind of burnt myself out, just working around the clock. And, when you're that age and you feel so passionately, you kind of feel like the world is on your shoulders and you have to, you can't rest. And so I had kind of become burnt out, and I realized that I needed a bigger perspective. But I won't say that I was wise enough to seek it out. It kind of fell in my lap. And now I think, well, that's Divine Mother. At the time, I was just grateful that I had found a way to understand my mind. When I was able to sit down and look at how my mind worked, I had never really thought about it in that sense. My mind was just doing what it did. And to be able to sit down and actually look at my mind and learn about my mind, I won't say control my mind, because we can't really control, but we can direct over time. So that was really a revelation for me, although very difficult, but that's classic mindfulness, starting with mindfulness, moving into awareness. Oh, okay, well, that's how my mind works. Well, after a few years of that, like, what's all this other Buddhist stuff? What are they talking about? And the student in me became, it just kind of is a natural evolution. So I didn't come from a religious background. I was Catholic until I was 7 when I quit. But the more that I learned about Buddhism, the more it made sense to me. And I liked that it was a science. I liked that it was the science of mind and a way of describing reality, and also that was very open to being questioned, demanded to be questioned, right? Don't take any of this on faith. Try it for yourself. See if it's true. See what happens. I really liked that. I felt like I wasn't being force-fed anything. It wasn't a cult. And, the more I looked into it, the more it was true. And you start to build a faith, right? As your own experience accords with what the wisdom teachers, have been saying for millennia. Their wisdom teachings, because they've been refined for millennia. And at a certain point, I just go, yeah, it's been true until now, and I'm going to take the rest of it too. Mm-hmm. And there's also that context though too. So I spent a lot of time trying to connect Buddhism and environmentalism, trying to make them fit together, looking for people who were fitting them together. Mm-hmm. Joanna Macy was somebody who was an influence on me early on. Because she was doing that. She was taking deep ecology and Buddhism and saying, here's how it fits together for us now in our time. And that was really, really important for me. And the idea of, at the time, she was doing something called the Council of All Beings. So that was really important to me as well, to say, hey, it's not just humans at the top of the food chain, we're in charge, because it didn't look to me that we were doing such a great job of being in charge. And I love the Council of All Beings to say, hey, we all have a voice in this. It's a circle, and let's listen to each other and learn from each other. So, and I had always felt the unfairness, I think. I really started off in campaigns that were very species-based. Mm-hmm. The dolphins were being drowned in tuna nets, was one of the first campaigns I worked on, and that grizzly bears were being forced out of their habitats. And that just made me really sad, because as a little kid, I felt like I'd been forced out of my habitat too. I grew up on the encroaching suburban edge of things, and it just seemed unfair to me, and still does. And so how can we come to a place of deep respect for all beings, and that we all have rights? This is a movement now that I find so inspiring, actually, is the rights of nature. We have this separation, there's people and there's nature. Well, we have human rights. To some extent, there's some animal rights, which is maybe more actually animal welfare. But this beautiful idea that's being led by Indigenous people in certain places more than others, but the edge of that I find really beautiful. This idea that rivers have rights, and so to me, that's where we come back to that justice for all beings, and it came out of the Buddhism, back then.
That's really beautiful. Your description of Buddhism reminds me a lot of what Swami Radha says about yoga, that especially the mindfulness part. When I started, I saw her, and the first workshop that I did with her was on mind and consciousness. And she asked the question, what is mind? And it was like a question as in psychology, but it was a question that no one had ever asked me before. And that evening, I just, she asked us to write about it. And it's like, I was up all night, like, what is mind? Watching that mind do the circles. And it's like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to respond to this question? It's really tricky. And so, and then in Realities of a Dreaming Mind, where we work with our dreams and that unconscious, more unconscious, bridging the conscious to the unconscious. At the very end of the book, she says, don't believe anything that I tell you. Find out for yourself. And I too was not religious, and I too loved that message. And my way in was through dreams, which was a mystery to me, but a mystery that had intrigued me all along. And she gave me a few keys to opening up those symbols. So I'm seeing parallels between Buddhism and yoga, and I wonder how you see that, having come to the ashram for a 3-month course, and you're a Buddhist and a conservationist, and you come to an ashram.
Right. Well, there's lots I could say about that. I mean, Buddhism came from India, so the roots are very entwined and intertwined, and we don't have time to go into a history of that. But I mean, Tara is one example of that. For me, Buddhism and yoga, I guess one thing that happened for me at YDC, and it's one of those things that you're like, yeah, I know, but now I'm like, oh yeah, right. I had fallen into yoga being the physical poses, and it's so much more. And it is science of mind. There's differences for sure. Buddhism is non-theistic, but is it actually, this whole question of what is mind is unanswerable. It can only be experienced. We'll never know. It's kind of the last big question, really. What is consciousness? But I guess I would say when I first, so I live here in Nelson. I've been practicing Buddhism since the early 90s. I came for courses at the ashram, and I really liked the Kundalini work. I really liked, because I've always been a big dreamer. There's always been lots going on there. And how do I make any sense of that? And I love working with the symbology. It's like magic. All of a sudden you're working with this symbol that opens up your mind in a whole new way. Wow, well, that's fascinating. And as a writer, I'm really fascinated by that. Mm-hmm. Wow, creativity. So I'm living in Nelson. It's the early 90s. I've come to a couple of classes, and then over time, the ashram started to feel like a refuge, a place where I could come and be a Buddhist, and that was fine. And the first time I came here, it wasn't the first time I came here, but at some point, it started seeping in the awareness that and I had always felt welcomed here. I had always felt that as a person who identified with Buddhism, I was really welcomed here, the iconography that I saw. What started seeping in over time was how much Tara iconography was here. And Tara is, she's a Buddhist deity, but she's very big in India, and she has her own amazing history, and she's this beautiful goddess. And I thought, okay, great. I can come here and I can do my practices, and everybody's beautiful and welcoming, and the land is wonderful. And it just felt very natural and very, safe and peaceful and beautiful, and that I could continue unfolding here. And it took me a while to get to the yoga development course. I'm incredibly glad I did, because it's really brought all those threads together for me at a time in my life. I'm 60, just turned 61. All of these threads are coming together for me. But the land here is also so strong. And you find that at retreat centers. I was involved with the Shambhala Buddhist community here in the West Kootenays for a long time. And we had retreat land down near a little place called Nelway. And it was a similar feeling. People practicing there, people meditating there for a long time. All the other beings respond. They do. They do, and you can tune into that. And it's just incredible. I remember being down at, it was called Sengeling. It's since passed out of the hands of the Buddhist community. But after a week of meditating there, I sat down beside a birch tree, and I could hear the sap moving, And you think, really? I'm like, yeah, really. So the ashram too has 60 years of history of everybody here, human and non-human, rejoicing together.
Yeah, it's in the atmosphere. One of the things we always say to people when they come to is that because it's this place that's being held, that has this one purpose, which is to allow people to open to their essence or their spiritual potential. That's the only reason the ashram is here. So everything else works around that. And we have to do stuff to keep it going, but that's its purpose. And so the feeling of safety, the feeling of being held is quite tangible. And people can enter in kind of cold, like never having been here before. And they're in a small group, and suddenly they're talking to people about the deepest things in their life. And what Swami Radha said, and I think it's true, is really letting the burdens go, being able to shed some of those responsibilities or imaginary responsibilities or weights that we carry as human beings, busy with their lives out there and entrenched in the society. It's like you can come here and drop burdens. And I feel like that unfolding or unhealing is what that's when you get in touch with yourself, with the divine in us. So the atmosphere is so important, and that you recognize that, and that I recognized that you recognize that. Mm-hmm. I saw that in the way you would approach an altar. I just wanted to go back to something you said about theistic. Because even though we have all these deities, and many of them are actually Buddhists and Bodhisattvas, and then there's the Krishnas and the Shivas and the Divine Mothers, 108 names, this huge pantheon, but all of them are symbols. So I don't consider yoga a theistic path. We use the symbolisms to understand different powers or different potentials in ourselves. And it's always a movement toward the more part, because there's always more potential than we can actualize.
Yes.
Which is what I love, because it is that open road. It is that open-ended path. It's not like, okay, if you do this, then you're going to get there. It's like, find out what's next.
I've been thinking a lot about this container principle, and the YDC felt like, that the ashram is such an amazing container, and the YDC felt like a force field within the container. But I kind of feel that way about the deities as well. It's like they're a frequency that you can tune into. And that was something that I really, really connected with during the YDC, was just this idea of like the old radio dial, you're just kind of tuning out the static and you're tuning in, and the immense power of that is that, untold billions of people have tuned into these deities, for a long, long time. Yeah. So there's a lot of power there. And we can just tap into that. Yeah. That's amazing.
It is. And it's also the power of the mind, because it gives the mind somewhere to go, right?
Yeah.
So instead of just sitting, watching the thoughts go by, it's like, okay, I'm heading to Radha, or I'm heading to Hariom, which is healing. So that thought of all those connections around that image or sound can be present for us.
Yeah, it's a shortcut.
It is a shortcut. And especially with sound, because we're putting our breath in, we're putting our voice in, and it does something. Okay, I'm curious about now, because you were here for 3 months, and you've been away for a few months, and you said you retired. So life has changed. What is happening for you now?
Well, one of the things with the YDC is that it kind of starts when it ends.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
So I didn't quite realize that. You should say that to people. You should tell them. And I thought I was leaving the YDC and I was going back to my job, and I was going to do that for a year or two and then maybe retire. And yeah, that's not what happened. That's not what happened. And so it was, tumultuous, emotionally, and lots of transition and kind of upheaval, honestly. So I'm actually now in this wonderful space of not knowing. And, it's back to that container principle and being here. And in the YDC, I talked about the force field, and my work situation had become a box, and that box was no longer fit. The box had changed while I was at YDC also, but then there was no container at all, and that was difficult, right? And so I've had to recreate a new container for myself, and it's a nest, actually. Yes, it's a nest. Right. Yeah, that feels really good. So you talked about how letting the burdens down allows more space. I'm paraphrasing you now, but what I saw you doing with your hands was more space. And for me, that's where insight arises, intuition arises, the idea that we can trust We can trust in the divine, that we don't have to control whatever's happening all the time. Sorry.
I can trust in the divine.
Oh, I can trust in the divine, right.
That old YDC moment.
Yes, that YDC moment. Thank you. Yes, I can trust in the divine in myself. So I don't have to figure out what's next. I can be in curiosity and trust and noticing and connecting. I'm really connecting to my garden. Yeah. And as the details and the busyness is really allowed to drop away, it's like an editing process. So what's important to me now? I care deeply about the planet. I worry, or I try not to worry so much as act. It's a very, very challenging time. So it's not like I retire and I'm, going golfing, nothing against golf, but, that's not what's going to happen. I made a joke earlier about I'm going back to the streets. Maybe I am, the threads of hope that I see, I want to figure out how I can follow and support those threads. When it comes to conservation, Indigenous-led conservation is the future. If we're going to come into right relationship with the land and the waters and all the other beings, Indigenous people are leading the way. And as settlers and even colonial history, conservation groups with colonial histories, we need to step back, step out of what we have thought of as leadership, and really become servants of Indigenous-led conservation. So what does that look like? I don't know, but it looks like uplifting as much, in ways that I can, and advocating. So finding ways to do that. It looks like more writing, for sure. Yeah, I think those are kind of the main threads that I see. I'm fascinated again by this idea of the rights of nature. I think that's a thread that I see there for myself. I also feel that at the community level, I'm interested in, because I've worked at the sort of, everything is local, but I'm also interested in how we, at a very basic community level, here in Nelson, here in the West Kootenays, we've got a lot more emergencies coming at us. Yeah. So even just really basic stuff like kitchen table kind of emergency preparedness is actually something that I'm finding myself curious about, how we support each other through all these traumas that are coming at us, wildfire seasons and all of it. I just kind of look for what inspires me. There's a group called Third Act in the United States. So Third Act being people 60 and over who are just organizing and getting active, and they get arrested in front of banks that are funding climate change, sitting in rocking chairs. And I just love that kind of stuff. So that inspires me. More yoga and more Tara, more Tara principle, infusing everything.
And what would that be?
Well, again, I kind of go to that shortcut, to that feeling of intuition and trust. Partly it's going where I'm asked, going where I'm called, just tuning in and listening and not feeling like I have to have a plan, and trusting that whatever I might have to offer is going to find the place that it's meant to find. There's really a letting go of having to have a grand plan, at least right now.
Right.
Yeah.
And I wondered, if you look back at your life, if you could see that kind of thread through it, because you might not have known as the angry young woman that you would become a conservationist, and that evolved. So almost like you can build trust based on what you've experienced in your life.
Totally. Yeah.
And all that value, all the knowledge, all of the experience that you've gained, she's going to want to use that.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think community is something that's so important in the world right now? How you build that, or how you connect people, how you bring people together. It seems to be part of what you do.
Definitely, yeah. After my retirement, suddenly there was all this space and time, and I found myself just walking places in town more and encountering the most interesting people, including people that had been my neighbors that I was just kind of too busy to notice. And I just, and I just felt really embraced and loved, and yeah, it was just this wonderful feeling. So yeah, I really have a lot of faith that, I learned so much at YDC, and I love the bhakti, karma, and jnana. So the devotion, the service, and the wisdom part. One of the take-homes for me from YDC, and it was wonderful to encounter it again on this visit, is something from the Kundalini book from Swami Radha, and she says, "In the will of the Most High, I am free." So really letting go of that idea that I'm the doer.
That's such a practice of surrender. You talked earlier about weaving together threads of hope. And given the serious state of the world right now, can you say what gives you hope?
Well, I will say it's always so great to come to the ashram and meet the young people that come here, and they really give me hope. That's something that I've always felt here. Like, who are these amazing young people who come, and they're at turning points in their lives. They're wondering, what am I going to do, and how do I be in the world? And their hearts are so open, and they're struggling, so that really gives me hope. I have faith in us. I do. I kind of have to, I guess.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, this has been such a pleasure.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Thanks for listening. Yasodhara Ashram is located in Kootenay Bay, British Columbia, Canada, on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Sinayaks and Ktunaxa people. You can find out more at yasodhara.org.